The story behind They Came to Toil is one of how newspapers covered Mexicans and immigrants during the Great Depression in an iconic city in the United States, San Antonio, Texas. Important not only for its role in Texas history, remember the Alamo, of course, but also important in terms of the development of an identity of Mexican Americans nationally. So the book starts with the 1929 and runs through the 1929 through 1934 period, which is the deepest recessionary period of the Great Depression, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research. So this is the worst period for homelessness, for joblessness, for hunger, for poverty in the United States. And everyone was suffering, almost everyone was suffering. But in this particular period also coincides with the first imposition of legal restrictions against entering the United States without documents. So before this, there was freedom to cross the border without having any documents. In 1929, it became against the law to do this. So all of a sudden, in a place and time where people were used to moving back and forth quite freely, things were grinding to a halt, and the machinery of deportation was beginning to wind up with calls for removal of the people that were perceived to be taking jobs from others. So in this story, there are three newspapers that are the main characters. So one newspaper was the San Antonio Light, which was owned by William Randolph Hearst, a well-known name to many people. At this point, he was the grandest newspaper titan in the world. He owned 28 newspapers. He had 5.5 million daily readers and 7 million on Sunday. So this was a lot for the Great Depression. And so he had a national newspaper and a giant megaphone. And then there was the locally owned San Antonio Express, an independent newspaper started in 1865 on the presses of a German newspaper in San Antonio. And it represented the railroad, ranching, and banking interests of the state of Texas. And then there was La Prensa, which was the Mexican immigrant-owned newspaper, started in 1913 by a refugee from the Mexican Revolution, Ignacio Lozano. It was nationally, actually transnationally circulated throughout the United States and Mexico. And so very important voice, the most important voice for Spanish-speaking people in the United States at the time. So the story is how, in the same space and time, these three newspapers wrote about the same, or didn't write about the phenomenon of massive amounts of Mexican Americans and immigrants being removed from the country. So more than 500,000 were removed in something called repatriation, which was a special process in which local and city officials from around the country got together and helped remove Mexican immigrants and many times their US-born children. And then there were just the outright deportations, which were roundups by Texas Rangers and other officials. So at this time, you can imagine crisscrossing through the state of Texas, trains loaded with thousands of people going back to Mexico, some voluntarily, some forcibly. And so this is a story about how all of this disposable labor was removed and how the newspapers characterized the role of Mexicans in our economy. So one of the central themes of the book is the making and unmaking of the American through the media. So in other words, when you think about history, most people think about, okay, I'm going to read a book about what happened, or what a historian is trying to tell me happened through the best means possible of data and resources and primary materials. So my work doesn't look at what happened. My work only looks at what newspapers said happened. So this is very important because the mediated representation, even today, is how we understand so many things that we can't experience. We're not in Syria. Most of us are not in Syria. What we understand about Syria, we see on television or read in newspapers or online, right? So this is the same idea that I'm looking at here. And so one of the key things about the coverage, then as now, of course, is how do these stories, how do these narratives help us understand or not understand who is American and who is not? So I'd like to just read a little bit from a pivotal scene in the book. And this was an article that was in the San Antonio Light on the front page. The San Antonio Light was, again, the Hearst-owned newspaper. And So the Hearst newspaper, the editorials were largely canned, written by, in many cases even written by Mr. Hearst himself or one of his national writers, and they were virulently anti-immigrant. But the news pages of the San Antonio tried to tell a different story in many cases. So here's a story about a march through the city of downtown San Antonio, a jobless march in 1930. The temperature was 80 degrees by 10 in the morning on April 7th, which was warm for a southwestern Texas spring day. By afternoon, San Antonio's heat wave would peak at 93 degrees. Weather, however, was no deterrent to 1,000 jobless San Antonians who met at the Plaza de Zacate to begin a protest march through downtown. The political climate was heating up too. Attitudes towards Mexicans, the city that had been simmering on a back burner, would boil over that day and make page one of the Light. The flashpoint was a communist-led parade of the unemployed that marched through downtown, past the Mexican consulate, where the mayor addressed them. A group of about 50 women were in the lead, some clutching small children. Quote, businesses along Houston Street, Alamo Plaza, and Commerce Street was practically suspended as the parade marched through those streets, and shop owners and clerks joined the huge gallery of sidewalk watchers, the Light reported under a banner headline. Waving placards that had met Mayor C.M. Chambers' prior approval, such as "We cannot be fed on hopes," the messengers endured bystanders' disparaging mutters. Quote, I think they turned Mexico loose in San Antonio, one watcher was reported to say. That notion was shared by many, according to the Light, which noted, quote, much comment could be heard concerning the nationality of the marchers, end quote. Embedded in these reactions was the racial coding of a Mexican appearance or coloring into something profiled as automatically non-American. Quote, send them back to Mexico if they want jobs, the Light quoted another onlooker. The othering continued with comments such as, quote, bet half of them are not American citizens. Another spectator went further, haven't seen one American yet. The Light made it clear that these were not isolated observations. Quote, other similar expressions could be heard on every hand. Suspicion about the marchers' nationality weren't limited to spectators. Immigration officials from various agencies mingled with the marchers, though no arrests were made, La Prensa reported. The lead paragraph of the Light maintained that, quote, less than a dozen Americans marched in the parade. So first let me tell you, so the Express, which was the other English language daily newspaper, it reported, for instance, that also the sense of onlookers, of people just kind of not sure what to make of this expression of Mexicans and Mexican Americans marching down the street, because the profile of the Mexican worker and why they were so accepted was that of a very docile worker, somebody very willing to work hard, very willing to do jobs that no one else wanted to do. And the Express wrote editorials about this, that, you know, why are you sending these people away? It's not like the white people are going to take these jobs, and this is directly from the Light. So, from the Express, but the Express reported, for instance, that priests on the steps of nearby San Fernando Cathedral just watched through binoculars at the crowd, and it was Lenten services, and I guess they were wondering where were their parishioners. The Light owned the story. It was an afternoon daily, and this march happened through downtown San Antonio right on their deadline, so they were able to cover it well. So La Prensa was the only paper to fully cover the entire parade route. It had a map of where everybody was coming from and where they were going and how this route was going to go through the city. And they also tried to keep a tally of how many Americans, and they put the number of Americans at 20. Now, mind you, this is over 1,000 people, so I'm not quite sure how they were able to determine who was American, who was not, unless they asked to see their documentation. But it's an example just of how people were characterized as American or un-American based merely on their appearance. So that is certainly something we see today as well. So one of the important takeaways I'd like people to have from the book is, of course, this idea that many of the ideas that they're hearing from politicians and legislators and in the media are recycled, and recycled many times over. And so that's one thing. The second thing I'd like them to think about is some of the things we haven't talked about yet, which is the construction of this Mexican-American identity, this national Mexican-American identity, and the role of the Spanish language newspaper La Prensa in helping develop a concept of a people. And we, in media history, in journalism history in particular, we pretty much know all the icons, the Joseph Pulitzer, who was also an immigrant, James Gordon Bennett, William Randolph Hearst. And we have begun to learn quite a bit about the black press, but not nearly enough. But the Spanish language press and many of the other ethnic minority presses are little explored, little studied. And I think greater exploration of those primary sources can tell us a lot more about these people and how important they were in the development of our economy. And I think another key issue is the idea of this particular Spanish language newspaper, which had correspondents that anonymously wrote from all over the country, telling vignettes about people that were being deported or other news. This was being done in the early 1900s, and it was something that we saw more recently when USA Today came out, and it had little sections from all over the country. This was considered a new idea. It was actually not a new idea. But more importantly, the Spanish language newspaper, it went on crusades. Like, it decided that there was no health care for Mexicans in San Antonio, no healthcare facility, and so the publisher Ignacio Lozano started a campaign to build a Mexican clinic. And he got people to donate from all over the United States, and he published every person's name and where they were from and how much they donated. So you would open the newspaper on certain days when the campaign was going on, and you would see that so-and-so from Fort Collins, Colorado had given $1, which was a lot of money back then, and that somebody from Yuma, Arizona had given 50 cents, and that somebody from Mississippi had given another 25 cents. And so one of the things that the newspaper does is it drew this picture for people of Mexican descent that they were a collective community, that they were a national community, and that when they worked together, they could contribute to the common good. They could be good citizens. So one of the primary narratives of the Spanish language newspaper was that Mexicans are good citizens. They're not just good workers, they're good citizens. They're good material for citizenship. And this was something that was not reflected in the English language newspapers. So one of the things I'd like to take away from people to take away from this is that if you really want to understand the people of the United States, you have to be considering all the resources, the primary resources, and drawing on those to get a clear picture. If you want to understand different points of view that are prevailing, you have to be consuming different media. So you have this phenomenon. It's almost as though not just Alice through the looking glass, but 3 Alices through 3 different looking glasses, and every Alice that goes through a looking glass ends up in a different virtual reality. And I say virtual reality again because it's a world of media representations. But the media representation is just that. It's a representation of the ideas, the consciousness of the people at that time. So I think it's clear that we've always had some differences and different ideas about certain kinds of immigrants, maybe not all immigrants, but certainly people from certain countries or from certain nationalities. And that to some degree, in some respects, we haven't really evolved very much in our thinking.